Turn it over to Allie. Allie, thank you once again for developing the second half, the methods and practice for program evaluation related to qualitative inquiry. Thank you again so much for doing this, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. If this is you coming back for the second half, that's great, welcome back. And if you are joining for the first time, as Carrie mentioned, you can access that recording with a request to Carrie. I will do a really brief touch back to last week, but this is meant to be a part two, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on what we talked about last week, but just a bit of a refresher. And as Carrie mentioned, my name is Allie Martin Schofield. She, her, hers are my pronouns, and I currently serve as the Associate Vice President for Campus Engagement and Dean of Students at Cleveland State University. I've been at CSU for 4 years, and prior to that, I was at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland for 4 years. And then before that, I was outside of Cleveland. I was in Philadelphia and Dallas, so I've moved around a little bit. The piece that I think connects to some of the work we'll be talking about today is some of the research work that I'm doing as part of my doctoral program. I'm hoping to wrap that up this coming fall. I have grand designs of maybe defending on Halloween Day. I don't know if it'll work out like that, but Halloween's one of my favorite celebrations, so that's my goal. But I will be finishing a PhD in urban education policy from Cleveland State, again, hopefully next fall. And my research is looking at what colleges and universities can be doing in order to make higher education more accessible for disabled students. And I'm doing a critical case study, a qualitative critical case study looking at discrit. So this is a little bit about me, and then I wanted to include kind of a fun facts slide as well. If anyone is a football fan and saw any of the games this weekend, and if you happen to have seen the Eagles game, Eagles and Cowboys, that's a pretty big rivalry. So I'm still recovering from that game. That was a rough game for all fans, but I am a big football fan. I'm a big reader. If anyone is looking for book recommendations, I've included my very amateur bookstagram that I do. I love going to shows, big fan of Playhouse Square, and I'm a mom of 4, so I have a lot of fun with my kids too. Here are some of the outcomes that we talked about last week, and I highlighted the 2 that we'll really be focusing in on this week. This week really is trying to get into some of those skills and assets so that when you leave the session today, you have some tangible things to take with you and some starting points or medium points. Maybe you're already doing a lot of this work and you're just wanting to kind of touch base on a few things. But here are our outcomes. Again, the 2 that we're really focusing on today would be engage in writing qualitative inquiry questions, determining observation strategies, and highlight areas of focus, and then practice basic data analysis, discussing various tools available to support the process. So a lot of the things that we're going to be working on today are workshop based, and we'll be dividing into small Zoom rooms or side rooms to work on some of those pieces and then report back. That way it's more specific to some of the things that you're wanting to work on and look at. And then Carrie and I will certainly still be available in kind of the main room to answer questions, and then share information for that reporting back piece. So the place we're going to start is designing your study. And here's a little bit of a refresher from what we went over last week, but I do think it's really important that we talk about quantitative and qualitative methods. I'm a big fan of both. I think you can find really rich data in both. I am, by preference, a qualitative researcher because in the work that I'm doing, I'm really trying to center disabled voices through stories and through narratives. And those can be achieved through qualitative means, but quantitative means certainly have a lot of good data and relevant, important data. And depending on what you're working on and what you're reporting to, quantitative data may be more respected or more tangible types of data that folks are looking for. There's still some debate in research between quantitative and qualitative. Again, for me, I think both are highly valuable, and hope folks take an opportunity to engage in both. Today's session will be highlighting qualitative methods. 5 primary types of qualitative research include these 5 listed here. ethnography, narrative, phenomenological, case study, and grounded theory. There are certainly others. These are the primary 5 that folks talk about. But again, there's historical, there's lots of other ways to engage in qualitative research. We will spend a bit of time looking at narrative and case study because we're going to be doing some coding and writing questions and things like that. Grounded theory, super important part of research, tends to take a significant amount of time because you are finding, developing, building a theory. Phenomenological is typically an individual's experience with one phenomena, so it may not be as transferable for this group to talk about. Phenomenological research is really fascinating, and there are a lot of really good studies that have been conducted, really meaningful studies around sexual assault prevention, sexual assault experiences, hazing prevention, things like that. So really good research there. We just won't be focusing on that method right now. And then ethnography, a study of people in their environment, uncovering patterns. Also really great. Some really good work around language and ethnography that I think is really interesting. As Carrie mentioned, and I'll just highlight again, if you have questions or comments or things to share, the chat is open for you, and you can also unmute yourself, and we'll get into some of these topics. So first and foremost, when you're thinking about your research or your evaluation, which we'll touch more on evaluation here in a moment, you want to be really thoughtful about identifying your participants. So this goes back to your primary question. And we talked about this a bit last week, but the research you're wanting to do starts with this primary question, this main idea that you want to learn more about. So in my dissertation, I want to know what colleges and universities should be doing to make higher education more accessible for students with disabilities. That's my big primary question. And the ways I go about answering that are all of the other pieces that we've talked about. So when you're thinking about identifying your participants, go back to that primary question and think about who may have insight to that primary question. Again, just thinking about my research, because I'm wanting to understand what colleges and universities can be doing for students with disabilities, I want to talk with students with disabilities. I want to talk to our disabled population. I also want to talk to colleges and universities. I want to make observations there. So me talking with folks who don't have those reference points may not be helpful for my research and answering my questions. So those wouldn't be participants that I would pursue. Think about who meets your parameters. We spent a little bit of time last week talking about the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. Every institution's is a bit different. You have a different IRB panel and way of reviewing these things. But to ensure that we are doing ethical human subjects research, we want to be working with our IRB. And so we want to outline those parameters within our IRB, within our informed consent, for the participants we want to talk to. So that's another thing to think about when you're identifying participants, your big question, and then outlining those parameters within your IRB. You want to think about a reasonable number. When we're doing qualitative research, a lot of times it's not a huge number of folks that you're speaking with. It can be. There are certainly wonderful qualitative research projects, thinking Marcia Baxter-Magolda's work, longitudinal studies, lots and lots of participants. So there certainly are those research studies. But a lot of the work that we're doing tends to be smaller groups of people. So 5 to 10 participants, 3 to 7 kind of participants, because you're trying to get an idea of their experiences and situate it in their experiences. So keep the number reasonable and think about all of the additional work that will go into those interviews when you're identifying your participants. And we'll talk about a little bit of that work here in a moment. Transcribing, things like that. And then you want to make sure you have informed consent. That's something you'll really work out through your IRB process, but you want to make sure that folks really understand what is being researched, what are the types of questions, what's going to happen with that information, how is that data being controlled and protected, how is their identity being maintained as anonymous, just all of those pieces. We want to make sure that our informed consent is really solid. And now we're getting to our first bit of information before we go into an activity. So writing questions. again, we're going back to our broad primary question, the main thing that's kind of tickling your interest. And then you have your secondary questions that connect to that big question. So I provided an example here connected to some of the work that I'm doing, just so you see a specific example to lean to. You don't have to agree with my questions. You don't have to phrase them in the same way, anything like that. I just wanted you to have this idea. We have this big kind of umbrella question, and then we have some secondary questions after that. And these questions, our broad question and our secondary questions, are what lead us to creating our interview questions, or our questions that we want to keep in mind when we're doing observations or when we're reviewing documentation as part of a case study or something like that. So broad question, secondary questions for your research, and then transforming those into your interview questions. And that's what our first activity is. So we're going to break into random assigned breakout rooms. Thank you so much, Carrie, for doing that. You're going to take time for everyone to write and share their primary question. Then if there's time, share secondary supportive questions. You may have a lot of research topics on your mind, and that's fine. If you have several primary research questions, that's great. You can share those. But if you're really trying to drill down into one specific research topic, research question, now is the time to do that. So you'll do that in small groups. Take just a few minutes to jot down some words or record some words, and then share in your small group. We'll come back in, we'll give every group about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and share. So we'll go ahead and break into those breakout rooms. And if you have any questions or anything, Carrie and I will be here in the primary room for your return. Thanks, Carrie.
Yeah, no problem. I was just like seeing, okay. Well, I'll broadcast to them in about, I'll give them like a 5-minute warning and then like a 1-minute warning
Great,
when the time comes. It looks like we've got one room with, oh no, there's, well, 3 people. And you should be able to bounce in and out of rooms. Do you have the breakout session thing on your screen by any chance? Or can you see it in the participant side?
Let me look. So I see who's in the meeting. It says breakout session. Right. And I think folks are back from the breakouts. Carrie, do we want to return, do we want to record the report out, or do we want to record after the report out?
Either way is fine with me.
Let's maybe wait to record until after the report out, just in case folks want that off of the recording. But I wonder, certainly as some of us are Title IX folks, and even some of our hazing prevention pieces, consent is really important, and certainly in this work too. So I like that even after the informed consent form has been signed and you have all of that in order, still the semi-structured interview process includes that in the beginning portion of the interview. It's built into the protocol. Researcher develops rapport with the participants, and then the interview settings are natural, private, and distraction-free environments. So the semi-structured interview and Dr. Galletta's work, I think, is really supportive of a lot of the different research that I've been doing, and that I find meaningful. And so I wanted to share that structure with y'all. Any thoughts or comments about a semi-structured interview process? Okay. Another piece that's really important when thinking about interviews is how you are maintaining that data. If any of you have ever done some research where you have lost some of your data, I think you may cheer along with this point as well. You want to have redundancies in place so that you don't lose your data, because you've already interviewed your participant. You don't want to have to go back to them and let them know that you don't have it anymore. And then it may not be as an authentic of an experience potentially if you're going through your protocol again and they're trying to remember what they said before. So my recommendations for interviews: have two means of recording if possible. So for example, a Zoom and a tape recorder. If you're doing your interview over Zoom, so if it's a remote interview, you can record it on Zoom, but you can also have a little handheld tape recorder. You can record on your phone. You can have lots of other means that work for you, but double the recording is great. That way, if one of them fails, if one of them has a technology issue, if one of them gets fuzzy and staticky, you have that second option already there, and it's harder then to lose your data. Closed captions is a great way to help with your transcription process. So for example, again, if you're using Zoom, if it's a remote interview, you can turn on your closed captions, and then when you're saving it afterwards, you have a transcript kind of, at least started, from the closed captions. You'll still need to go through certainly and edit and make sure everything was captured, but it is a nice starting place. Transcribe immediately while it's fresh in your mind. So instead of booking interviews back to back to back, I highly recommend booking an interview and then having time to transcribe right after that. There will be pieces that you may forget if you're doing back-to-back interviews, or if you're waiting maybe until the weekend to transcribe them. I know that can be really hard. I know we're super busy. I heard folks coming into the meeting today, you're kind of doing double duty, doing your job and listening in and handling students and those kinds of things. So I recognize that is challenging, but if you can transcribe immediately, it's helpful. You can also do some memoing during your interview. So if you're in person and there are things that you are observing in body language, or where pauses are, when you're taking your notes, you have your recording devices, so they're getting the exact wording that folks are sharing, but your memoing can be, oh, this person seemed upset when I asked this question, or this person seemed really excited when I asked this question. You can have your own memoing notes that you refer back to that can add some more rich data to your interview. Some folks use a transcription service. Most of the ones that I have found have a fee attached to that. So that's up to you, again, how large your research project is and if you're able to use a transcription service. I tend to transcribe my interviews myself. I want to really get into the weeds of the data, but I also am not working with huge populations in my interviews. I'm around the 7 to 10 folks for my interviews. So my transcriptions aren't, upwards of 30. There's some really amazing research going on, talking with folks and their experiences through incarceration, and they're going to jails and talking with folks, and they have data upon data upon data. And so using a transcription service certainly makes extra sense there if you're working with a large population. But for smaller populations, if you're able to transcribe yourself and have some of those supports in place using closed captions and things like that, it may save some money, and it may allow you to get a little closer with the data potentially. You want to make sure you are editing thoroughly, capturing any typos, any misunderstandings between you and the participant, anything like that. You want to consult with your IRB ahead of time, but just make sure you're following your IRB around saving data. Where are you saving that? Who has access to it? What's password protected? Do you have any hard copy files? And then another recommendation is to do member checking. This is something I really like doing with my participants. Is I transcribe the interview, I edit it as thoroughly as I possibly can, and then I send it back to them to do member checking for them to review and make sure, did I capture what they were wanting me to in the first place? So if they want to rephrase something, or if they ask that I remove something, I'm happy to do that because I consider it to be their interview, their narrative. But that's up to you. If you're doing member checking, recognize that folks may take out some information that you wanted for your study or that you wanted for your research. So member checking has some potential pros and cons there too. Any other tips around interviews and recording data before we get into some coding? Okay. So in an interview, we're looking at some qualitative coding. Again, there are a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to share you one method that works for me. I'm primarily using Saldana's book, but there are, again, lots of different ways to do coding. I'm a big fan of in vivo codes, which are direct quotations from folks, because my research is centering disabled voices. So I'm wanting their exact phrasing and terminology and things incorporated into my research. But that may not be as important to you and the work that you're doing. It goes back up to your big question. So when you're looking at qualitative coding, you remember that the researcher, as the primary instrument, engages with the data. It is through reflective and thoughtful engagement with their data that allows researchers to interact with the process, and codes and themes evolve organically. A code book, which again, I highly recommend, and I'll show you an example. The goal is to ensure that you're thinking critically about what you are doing, why, checking biases, checking assumptions. You can do coding in a lot of ways. And then initial coding using direct quotes from a transcript, for example, is in vivo codes. So the way that I do coding primarily follows this streamline, in vivo coding to initial codes to a category to a theme. And then the themes are some of the pieces that I really explore and hash out. So we will move forward to an example of a code book. So here's an example of a code book. You have an in vivo code, which is a direct quote, pseudonyms, and then the numbers next to it are the lines in the transcript where you can find the direct quotes. And then after I collected all of the important quotations, I went and did my initial code names, and then I started grouping into categorized codes. Once I did that, my code book evolved into initial codes, categories, and themes, where I didn't have to have specifically the in vivo codes there anymore, the direct quotes, because I'd already pulled those. So I have my initial codes, categorizing those, and then moving that into a theme. And this did allow me to move and flush things out within my code book. And then I used some color coding. And here's another example. Again, a different theme, critical review and change to systems, category with systems, and the initial codes connected to those themes. I do a lot of my coding either in a management system or in Excel. I have a colleague who does their coding using big Post-its and then smaller Post-its and color-coded Post-its on the wall of their basement. Coding is very personalized, I think, to the researcher. And there is a technology options, but there's also, again, the big Post-its and smaller Post-its on your wall work just as well. Whatever works best for you is the coding system that you want to be using. You may not agree, and I'll go back a few slides, you may not agree with the way that I'm doing my coding. Some folks maybe read through their entire interview and pull themes from that, and then go back and find quotations that connect to that. Some folks only do an initial code and then a theme, and they don't have categories. It really is up to you, and there are lots of supportive resources there to help you. I think Saldana is one of the best, but there are lots of options. So again, these are examples of code books from different research projects and pilot studies. But I want to make sure you all have an opportunity to do your own coding practice. So what we have here is an example of a question that was asked to a participant. I've edited some things out here, but a question was asked to a participant and then a participant's response. In order for you to do this, you may want to take a screenshot of this text. It is dense text. It's not something that I could cut and paste into the chat for you easily to access. And I don't know if you'll have access to the chat when you're in your breakout rooms. But you want to make sure you have this coding practice text available, because the next step is for you to go into a breakout room and work on this coding practice. How you do that in your breakout room is up to you. You may want to take a few minutes to read through on your own, find your own codes, themes, things like that. You may want to start as a group and kind of go line by line with finding those codes. Again, that's completely up to you, but we are going to do a breakout activity for you to do that. And again, we'll have about 10 minutes to do this activity. And thanks, Carrie, again for your help with the breakout rooms. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We're going to jump right back in as folks are coming back to the main meeting room. All right, would anyone from either of the breakout groups like to share what coding practice was like?
I can share.
Please.
Okay, so I think I was room 3. I don't remember how many rooms there are. 3, yeah. Okay. And in looking at this, we were trying to just kind of think about what themes we saw here that we also thought may come up in other responses, if we were looking at multiple responses. And we were looking at that drive or that experience that somebody has had connected to disability, both personally and professionally, and disability as well as mental health. So maybe kind of like 4 different themes, like somebody's personal connection to disability and their professional connection to disability, and then personal connection to mental health and professional. Because we think a lot of people that go into a field like disability studies, disability aid, have some kind of personal connection really frequently to disability, just like with any helping profession, really, as well with like mental health. So those were kind of themes that we pulled out of from this response and would be looking for in other responses possibly. We think that answers the question, but we weren't 100% sure.
Awesome. No, thank you. And I know it's challenging also when you're just seeing this for the first time. This isn't an interview you participated in. This wasn't, when you're doing this more organically, it hopefully will flow a little bit differently, but I think that's great. And so were you coming up with kind of 4 codes then, 4 kind of themes maybe towards the end? Great. Our other group, how was this process for y'all? If anyone wants to share. Okay. We certainly don't have to. For me, I think one of the hardest things to do is to get started with coding. I don't know if other folks have had that experience or want to share their experiences if they've done some coding for interviews. But sometimes I can get all caught up in my head, and I have sort of a stutter start. So I'll start and I'm like, no, I don't like that. I'll start again and no, I don't like that. And I really have to get in a groove with my coding. I do try to do, depending on how long the interview is, but I do try to do the full interview all in one sitting so that I'm sort of in the same headspace and mind flow, and connecting some of those themes together. And because I like to start with in vivo coding, what I'm pulling out as interesting quotations may be different than what other people would pull out as interesting quotations. And certainly could be different than what other participants may be saying. You know, I could find something really interesting that's sort of a one-off, standalone kind of experience that isn't transferable or similar to other people's experiences, and that might be noteworthy as well. Any other thoughts on the coding practice before we move on to some observation strategies? Okay. So mentioning if folks are wanting to do a case study that may be comprised of interviews as well as observations. And so what are some things that you can observe? If you were at a site, you're in that specific bonded case, you're in that one case study, what might be some things that you could observe or places that you could observe important information related to y'all's work in prevention?
I'll make sure I understand. Do you mean like, are we asking questions where we're observing as well, or just purely like where can I kind of just visually observe what's going
Yeah.
on and draw maybe some information from that?
Yeah, just visually observe, draw some information from spaces, different spaces or settings.
So I don't know if this applies to this or not. The area I'm thinking about within my role is sexual misconduct prevention education and we're trying to work more to like engage students in programming. And so on a day that we had a bystander intervention training scheduled, and it was our one in-person event because we're kind of coming back from having lots of, through COVID and some of the past years, virtual. So at that same day, there was a parking forum where parking was having an in-person like event where people could come and ask questions, Q&A panel. And it was also in person in the same building area. And so when nobody showed up for ours, I was like, let's go see what parking's looks like. Let's see. And we went, and there were definitely people there, and there were people showing up and coming and going. And so I started thinking about, that was, early in our semester. And I was like, okay, what's the difference here? And one of the things I just kind of comparing, like, what might we take away from the fact that they like had attendance and observing like what they had going on. So I think that could be a strategy, is looking at other events and stuff going on campus and thinking about, what's the difference? What are they doing? What can you kind of emulate? What can you not? And I did joke around about, like, because parking is always one that people are upset about. So I was like, we'll just title our event, let's talk about parking. And then, I mean, that's not at all the case, but so you couldn't do that. That would be wrong. But that, was my humor of the moment, is when people are fired up about something, they want to attend that event where they get a chance to complain.
Yeah.
So I think that's, does that answer? Is that an opportunity for observation?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I love our parking colleagues too, but yes, they certainly bear the brunt of some disgruntledness, I think. But yeah, it could be observing, if your big question earlier, someone mentioned, do folks even know what Title IX is? And so if you're phrasing an event that's come learn about Title IX, but folks already don't know what Title IX is, it may be like, well, do I want to know what that is? I don't know. But folks know what parking is. How else are they marketing? Is their space different? Did they have snacks? Did they have a raffle drawing? But making some of those observations. You could also, in spaces, observe, who is coming into a Title IX space, who's coming in to make reports, who is coming in requesting information. Could do that if you have residential communities. You could be in a lounge or a lobby and make observations of, the ebbs and flow of traffic, communication patterns, interactions. You could observe folks selecting information from other offices, if you have pamphlets or hot cards or things like that, who's taking those, or if no one is taking those, that's also an observation. Just thinking about, there are lots of ways for data collection, and thank you so much for sharing this great example. There's a lot of ways for data collection, and it doesn't have to be through an interview. It can be through your observation. It can be from things you're hearing about or witnessing or viewing. If I am doing, for my research, if I'm looking at this critical case study on access for disabled students, I need to situate myself in different spaces and see the physical access points, and are there challenges there? And I need to observe that for a critical case study model. What about documents that may be helpful to review in a case study? This may be policies. This could be procedures, things on hot cards. If you do any sort of intake form, if you have an on-campus police department or security department, what do their forms look like? What are people asked to complete related to Title IX or hazing? Your incident report form, your public reporting form, those can all be sort of documents or web sources for observation. And you can get a lot of really good data there. Similarly to when we do any sort of newsletter or things like that, and we look at the open rate. You know, if people click on this and they open it, are we saying they're viewing it? Are there certain articles they're not clicking on? All of that data is important to look at and ask questions of, and it may tie back into your big question.
Allie, there's some comments in the chat, including common areas where services are delivered, marketing materials, language and images used, time of day, the day of the event. And then also we had a Purple Ribbon Campaign Day during our Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We tracked how many ribbons were placed in bowl in different places on campus and how many were collected to see which locations had the most traction within the campaign.
I love that. You can really get some interesting modeling around flow of information. I love that idea of the purple ribbons, this tangible thing and the movement there. Marketing materials, languages and images, absolutely. If any folks are doing social norming, if anyone is doing some things around John journals or toilet talks or things like that, you know, the information in there, reviewing that to make sure it's inclusive for all of the different types of restrooms where it may be placed, and for people who are reviewing that material. Make sure it's accessible from a disability standpoint, make sure it's accessible from a language standpoint. I know that's something that we put, we needed to put some additional time into, is that some of our materials used just colloquialisms or slang, like what does hooking up mean? And is that transferable across everyone in our population? So just looking at those things, absolutely. Thank you for all of those comments. I promised that we would go back and talk a little bit about evaluation. Last week, we did outline the ways in which evaluation is different from research, but some of the methods are really similar. So you may be doing interviews or observations and things, but they are for an evaluation versus research. So process evaluation, looking at quality of programs, contents, products, or delivery. So folks have talked about previously bystander intervention programs. Maybe that's a process evaluation. Outcome evaluation measures changes in people or conditions. That could be perhaps a climate survey or a pre and post survey. And then a cost analysis assesses cost and benefits. When you're looking at evaluations, you may want to start with a logic model. And folks may be familiar with this with grant writing. If you're doing any grant writing or funding sources, logic models tend to be pretty common requests for those. But evaluations also really benefit from a logic model, looking at inputs, activities, outputs, and impacts. And your logic model can help determine your timeline, your resources, your activities. I am a visual learner, so I recognize that I like the charts and the checklists and the semi-structured interviews, and I also really like a logic model. So I wanted to share two examples here. One is kind of a K through 12 example. You have your inputs, activities, outputs, and impacts. So your inputs, looking at staff, facilities, and resources. Your activities support the goals of the program, leading to your outputs, which are also known as outcomes. And then your impacts, and we want to look at the intended and unintended impacts of different programs. So inputs, in this K through 12 example, could be state grants, could be local volunteers, could be private university professors, could be a pre and post survey. The activities, the actual piece that's being evaluated, the activities, the outputs or outcomes, what is the purpose, and then the impacts. So that's one example. And then looking at a higher education example that I can speak to, a program that we're currently working on at Cleveland State University, which is our co-responder program, which is a independently licensed social worker, which will accompany our police department for crisis response calls. And so doing a program evaluation around the co-responder program. So inputs, federal grant, a grant administrator, the co-responder, so the actual person, the advisory board, matching financial commitment, office equipment, marketing, evaluator. So those are examples of inputs. The activities, hiring the co-responder, training and onboarding, ongoing case review, budget calculations, evaluation, etc. The outputs, so why we're doing this program. Increase the percentage of mental health calls for service, which are met with a trained behavioral co-responder. Increase outreach to students, build community partnerships. So all of our outputs related to this grant, and then impacts. Again, those intended and unintended. So CSU community will feel more comfortable, additional mental health support, image around police and mental health, et cetera, et cetera. So really kind of mapping out on this logic model, who all is involved, what are the activities we're going to do, why we're doing it, and what do we believe the impact will be. And that can be really helpful as you're designing evaluations. So I wanted to give folks a moment. And we can, checking our time, we can just do this now as a group. We don't have to go into breakout rooms, but take a few minutes to think about a logic model for an evaluation. So just take a few minutes to think about inputs, activities, outputs, and impacts around maybe a program you want to evaluate. Inputs can be who are the people, what are the resources, what's the budget, what are the necessary items, activities, what is actually happening. So if it's bystander intervention, what are the meetings, what is the training, outputs or outcomes. By participating in this, we hope they're learning this, and then impacts both intended and unintended. And we'll just take a couple of moments for folks to think about that. And as folks are considering these logic models, I want to just share that designing evaluations is pretty significant work. That's not to say that you all aren't already doing it and already have a good method to do that. But there's a lot that goes into designing evaluations. It's an entire professional field. And so in our hour and a half today and our hour and a half last week, and with the nuanced pieces that we all have in our communities, I didn't think designing an evaluation would be helpful because of, again, the individualized pieces, but I did want to provide kind of a listing of things to consider when designing evaluations. So evaluation sponsor, if necessary, again, if this is connected to grant funding or a sponsor, the context, why, what is the history, the clients and the stakeholders, the purpose and intended audience, evaluability of the program, if there are any political, social, or cultural barriers to the evaluation, questions to be addressed, again, your big question plus your follow-up questions, description of methods used to answer questions, and this is where it connects to research. It could be interviews, it could be case study, it could be gathering data, it could be observation. Evaluation management plan, which is kind of your timeline and your budget. You have your logic model, which is really broad. Your evaluation management plan is really more of a checklist or Gantt chart. You know, it really has those pieces there. Your scoring rubric for your evaluation, and then certainly other things. But these are some of the big areas to include in an evaluation. Back to our logic model question. Does anyone want to share their thoughts around a logic model, or perhaps one that they've already done or one they're thinking about doing related to evaluation? And you can unmute or answer into the chat. I find logic models really helpful because they keep me on track with all of the different pieces that I need to be thinking about, especially in larger projects, thinking about going back here to our co-responder model. Not that this is the best logic model, or other folks may have some different ideas here, but I know my role as Dean of Students, and I know my small little piece connected to this, but a logic model helps me see kind of the broader scope and things that we need to be concerned about, and that doing an evaluation, it's not just the pieces that I'm aware of or connected to, but if we're really evaluating the full program, the marketability, who may use this program, who may have issues or concerns with this program, who may not want to engage in this way at all, who may have some fears. Could this program cause harm? How would we repair that harm? So the logic model helps me think a bit more broadly about a program that I just have a piece of a role in. Any thoughts on logic models before we move on? Okay. Well, as promised, I wanted to mention some data tools that I think are really helpful. As I've mentioned earlier, there are lots of different data tools, and you may have your favorites, and those may not be listed here, but these are ones that I've used and I recommend. The University of Chicago offers a great comparison site. I think the University of Pennsylvania does as well, just some different comparisons on some of the various data tools that you can use. Most of these have a lower cost feature, especially if you're a student, or your universities may already have university memberships, perhaps through your university library. Otherwise, there are fees associated with a lot of these programs, so that's something to keep in mind. So Zotero, it organizes your data and your references. It's has free and open source reference management software and manages bibliographic data and related search materials. So it's a database for you. Mendeley, excuse me, used to manage and share research papers. It lives on your local computer, but it syncs with a web account. EndNote Web is web-based, accessible from any computer, and it hosts citations. So again, if you're doing a lit review, things like that, those are really helpful. Qualtrics, taken from the Qualtrics site, they call it an experience management software, but many of us may know it from designing surveys or evaluations, other data collection options. It is really great for designing evaluations if that's something you're wanting to look into, as opposed to going the research route. The evaluation tools in Qualtrics are really good. And then SurveyMonkey, certainly, there are free and paid options there, and a lot of us are familiar with those. There's also Google Forms and lots of other ways to do data collection, but these were some primary ones I wanted to mention. And finally, I wanted to give some time for questions. If we didn't touch on the piece that you were really hoping we would touch on, if you have a specific question for your university, I'm happy to hear those, or if you want the perspective from the group. We'll do questions while I keep my contact information up here should you want that. But I'm here and available to answer any questions or concerns, offer clarity that folks may have if I can.